The salt cellar stood at the center of the long table like a small silver monument to everything Cordelia Vane had lost. She had not meant to notice it. She had told herself in the carriage from the inn that she would not notice anything this evening that could be made to wound her. She would look at the candles and the plasterwork ceiling and the faces of people she did not know, and she would conduct herself with such measured decorum that no one present would guess that the placement of her chair 6 seats below the gilded cellar, well below the salt, beside a minor clergyman who smelled faintly of camphor, had been deliberate. She knew it had been deliberate. Lady Fenwick had smiled when the footman guided her to the chair. The smile had been too brief to read as warmth, and too satisfied to read as accident. Cordelia smoothed the front of her gown. Ivory silk pressed that morning with particular care, the only evening dress she had brought that was not mended, and arranged her face into the expression she had been practicing since her father's funeral, a look of attentive pleasantness that revealed nothing. At the far end of the table, above the salt and above most considerations that applied to her present circumstances, the Viscount Aldenmere sat in conversation with Lord Fenwick. She could see only his profile from where she had been placed, a jaw that angled with unusual precision, dark hair combed back from a high forehead, broad shoulders held so still inside his coat that the coat itself seemed carved rather than worn. He had not looked at her since the introductions in the drawing-room, which had been brief and had not included Lady Fenwick moving to facilitate them. He had looked at her only once in the moment before they were separated by the general progress toward the dining-room, and the quality of that look was something she could not yet name. It had not been dismissal, it had not been pity. She was not certain it had been anything she could safely allow herself to think about. The clergyman beside her, a Mr. Pelham, offered her the bread-basket. She thanked him, and took a piece, and broke it into smaller pieces, and did not eat any of them, because the knot below her sternum had not yet loosened enough to permit eating. Cordelia Vane was 23 years old, the daughter of a Hampshire solicitor, who had died in the autumn, leaving behind him a comfortable house, an uncomfortable quantity of unpaid bills, and the discovery that the comfortable house had been mortgaged twice. She was educated, her father having seen to that with the stubborn generosity of a man who believed that knowledge was the one inheritance no creditor could claim. And she was capable. And she was, when not placed below the salt at a Fenwick dinner table, possessed of something that occasionally passed for composure. She had come to Finnick Park as the companion of her father's oldest friend's widow, a Mrs. Ite Hartwell, who had offered her the post with such careful tact that Cordelia had understood she was being offered charity dressed as employment, and she had accepted it with such careful gratitude that she had almost believed the dressing. What she had not expected was that Mrs. Empersey Hartwell would fall ill 3 days into the visit and take to her bed, leaving Cordelia to present herself at Lady Fenwick's dinner table alone, and with no social currency whatsoever beyond a face that was, as the room had apparently decided within 10 minutes of her arrival, pleasant enough but irrelevant. To Lady Fenwick's gathering, she was nothing more than a country solicitor's daughter, with an empty purse, and no connections worth naming. The candlelight moved across the tablecloth in small, warm shifts, and Cordelia looked at her bread and not at the salt cellar, and told herself that the evening was finite. If you have ever sat at a table where you were made to feel invisible, stay with Cordelia tonight. Her story is only beginning. She had nearly managed to convince herself that the dinner would pass without further incident, when Lady Fenwick's voice carried down the length of the table with the particular carrying quality of a woman who had spent 40 years ensuring her voice reached every corner it needed to reach. Miss Vane is with us as a companion to poor Mrs. Comber. Hartwell, Lady Fenwick said, addressing the woman to her left. A Miss Portia Greaves, who was blonde and composed and wearing the kind of sapphire earrings that announced family money without troubling to explain it. A country girl. Her father was a solicitor of some sort. The phrase landed where it was aimed. Several heads turned, performed the assessment, and turned away again. Miss Greaves offered a small, symmetrical smile in Cordelia's direction that conveyed acknowledgment without interest. Cordelia kept her eyes on Mr. Pelham, who was saying something about the weather near Gloucester. It was the first time she had been publicly labeled that evening, but not, she suspected, The last. The Viscount Aldenmere, at that same moment, had turned his head very slightly in the direction of Lady Fenwick's voice. It was such a small motion, barely a degree of rotation, that Cordelia would not have seen it at all, except that she had, despite her best intentions, been watching the table above the salt, with the sideways attention of someone who has learned that direct looking costs more than peripheral awareness. He did not respond to Lady Fenwick's remark. He did not look at Cordelia. He turned back to Lord Fenwick and said something quiet, and Lord Fenwick laughed, and that was all. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself this very firmly through the fish course. His name was Edmund Carow, Viscount Aldenmere, and she knew almost nothing about him except what Mrs. Percent. Hartwell had mentioned in passing on the journey that he was 31, that he had held the title for 4 years since his father's death, that he had not returned to society until recently, and that the reasons for the gap were not spoken of in company. Mrs. Hartwell had patted her own lap rug at that point and looked out the carriage window, which was the closest she ever came to, indicating that a subject was finished. The dinner progressed. Cordelia ate the fish, and then the roast, and then declined the pudding because the knot had not fully loosened, and she talked with Mr. Ferty. Tell him about a sermon he had recently written on the subject of patience, which she found, under the circumstances, almost formally appropriate, and she did not look at the Viscount Aldenmere again until the table rose to separate and she had no choice. He was crossing the room toward the door, and he walked directly past the chair where she sat, and for a moment, one very still moment, he stopped. Not because the path was blocked, there was room enough to pass. He stopped and looked down at where she sat, with her unpoured wine and her broken bread, and something moved across his face that she was too uncertain to name. And then he said, his voice low, and carrying only to her, "The placement was not of my arranging." She did not know what to say to that. He did not appear to require a response. He continued through the door. Cordelia sat for a long moment after the other women had filed past, and then she rose, and she kept her face arranged in its practiced pleasantness, and she told the small fire of something warming in her chest to be reasonable. He had said 5 words. He had not invited trust. She was careful that way. She had learned to be careful. The drawing room after dinner was warmer, and the company had rearranged itself along lines that Cordelia understood at once. The women of consequence had gathered near the pianoforte, and the women adjacent to consequence were moving carefully toward that gathering, and Cordelia stood near the window with a cup of tea she did not want, and watched the geometry of it with the mild, professional attention of someone who has no stake in the outcome. Miss Greaves played the pianoforte tolerably well and received the expected compliments. Mrs. Colbury sang and received rather more compliments than the singing warranted. The room was full of the particular pleasant noise of people performing enjoyment. Lady Fenwick crossed to Cordelia's window with a purpose that announced itself 2 steps in advance. "You must not feel awkward," Lady Fenwick said, in the tone of a woman who was producing awkwardness as she spoke. "These occasions can be difficult for those without the usual social footing." She looked at Cordelia's cup. "Mrs. Preet, Hartwell speaks highly of you. I am certain you are very capable." "Mrs. Hartwell is very kind," Cordelia said. "She is." Lady Fenwick's gaze moved past Cordelia to the window. "Though I do think she might have considered whether this visit was well timed, given her health. It puts you in rather an odd position." She smiled the same brief smile she had worn at the dinner table. "Still, one manages." Lady Fenwick moved away. "One manages." Cordelia turned the phrase quietly in her mind, like a stone to see what lived beneath it, and found exactly what she had expected, the polite version of a reduction. A country solicitor's daughter with nothing to manage was, in this room, a species of furniture. Useful, possibly, and easily repositioned. She had been repositioned all her life. She had learned to root herself in things that could not be moved. A clear head, an honest reckoning, the knowledge that her worth had never depended on anyone in this room for its source. She set down her tea and moved toward the bookshelves along the far wall, because the bookshelves were unlikely to wound her. and because she was genuinely curious whether Lady Fenwick owned anything worth reading. She did not hear the door. She became aware of a presence to her left, by the particular quality of stillness that accompanied it, which was different from the room's general motion, and different from the way Mr. Stedding Pelham moved, and different, she thought, from almost anyone she had been near this evening. "You read," the Viscount Aldenmere said. It was not a question. "The title is legible from where you are standing," she said, before she could recalibrate it into something more appropriately suppressed. He looked at the book in her hand, which was a volume of natural philosophy she had taken from the shelf without much planning. Then he looked at her. The directness of it was something she was not prepared for. Not the assessing look men gave women at dinner tables, which was inventory, but something more like the look of someone checking to see if what they suspected was confirmed. "Natural philosophy," he said. "My father kept a good library," she said. She returned the book to the shelf with more deliberateness than was perhaps necessary. "I am accustomed to reading what is there." What was in his library? She named several titles. His expression did not change precisely, but the quality of his attention did, in a way that she felt, rather than saw, a shift that moved from simple observation into something more sustained. He asked a question about the natural philosophy, a specific question about a subject she knew well, and she answered it honestly and in more detail than he had perhaps invited. And he asked another question. They stood at the bookshelves for 11 minutes. She counted afterward, because it seemed important to know how long it had been. He spoke, as people speak, who are not accustomed to performing speech. He had a slight economy of phrasing that was not coldness, she thought, but rather the habit of someone who had learned that words spent carelessly were words that could not be recalled. She recognized the habit. She had it herself. When Mrs. Colbury laughed loudly near the pianoforte and the room's attention shifted, he said quietly, "Will you be at the assembly on Thursday?" She said she did not know. Mrs. Hartwell's health was uncertain and she could not attend alone. He said, "I believe Mrs. Hartwell will be sufficiently recovered by Thursday." He said it with such contained certainty that she could not tell if it was a prediction or a plan. And then he inclined his head and returned to the portion of the room that contained Lord Fenwick. Cordelia stood at the bookshelf for a moment longer. Something was warm along her sternum, in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. She told it to be very, very careful. The assembly at Yelverton took place in a room that the county considered elegant, and that Cordelia recognized as the honest ambition of a market town that had done its best with plaster and lamplight and 2 good musicians. She had come with Mrs. Nobby. Hartwell, who had indeed recovered, who sat near the door with a pleased expression that Cordelia could not quite read, and she had worn the ivory silk again because she had brought nothing better, and she had arranged her hair herself because she could not afford a maid. She danced twice with Mr. A. Pelham, who was a careful if uninspired partner, and once with a young man whose name she did not catch, and she stood during the 3rd set near the refreshment table and watched the room and thought about nothing in particular. She became aware of the Viscount Aldenmere by the sound of the room adjusting to him. It was not that anyone spoke his name. It was the subtler music of social weight-shifting, the way certain rooms tilt slightly on their axis. When a significant person enters, and the tilt is felt before it is seen. He came in from the side door with Lord Fenwick, and he looked across the room with the particular attention of someone looking for something specific. He found her. The look lasted 3 seconds. Then he moved into the room without haste. He asked her for the next set. He asked it in the plain, declarative form of a man who rarely positions requests as negotiations, but his voice was quiet enough that only she heard it. She said yes, which was perhaps not the measured decision she had intended, but which had come out before the measuring could happen. They danced. The set was a country dance, which meant they were often separated by the figures and often returned to each other across the floor, and in the separation she had the particular awareness of exactly where he was in the room without looking, which was useful in the figures and unsettling as a general condition. He danced well, not with the performance of a man who wants to be seen dancing well, but with the quiet adequacy of someone for whom the body follows the music without requiring celebration. In one of the returns, when they were briefly side by side and moving together before the next figure, he said without looking at her, "You are watching the room." "A useful habit," she said. "What do you see?" She almost told him honestly. She almost said it aloud, nearly named what she saw in the room. The way Lady Fenwick had placed herself to observe him, without appearing to observe him the way Miss Greaves watched him from behind her fan, with a calculation more practiced than it appeared. The way no one in the room had looked at her, since he asked her to dance, except to look at her. Looking at him, she almost said all of that, but the figure separated them before she could, and when they returned she only said, "Enough." He understood that she had edited herself. She could tell from the slight compression of his mouth that was not quite a smile. After the set, he thanked her, and she curtsied, and he went to speak with Lord Fenwick, and Cordelia stood for a moment in the space the dance had occupied, and told herself nothing at all, because there was nothing she could safely tell herself. It was Mrs. Hartwell who said it first on the carriage home, with her lap rug arranged and her voice deliberately easy. "He is a good man, I think, whatever the county says." "What does the county say, Cordelia?" asked Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. That he was married 4 years ago, that the marriage was unhappy, or so they claim. She looked at the dark window, and that the loss of it marked him, though whether that means what people think it means, I cannot say. She glanced at Cordelia. "He lost a child as well. A daughter? She lived only 6 weeks. The carriage moved through the dark, and Cordelia looked at her hands in her lap, and felt the shape of something she had not yet permitted herself to understand, and did not speak. He was carrying something that had not been named to her. She had seen the outline of it at the dinner, in the economy of his speech and the stillness of his coat, and now the outline had a form. A daughter who had lived 6 weeks. A marriage that had become grief before it finished being a marriage, and 4 years of returning to a world that had opinions about all of it. She had spent 4 months learning to carry her own losses in silence. She understood with a precision that moved through her, like water through cracked stone, why he chose words carefully. The following morning he came to call, which was the sort of thing that was noted and would be repeated, and Lady Fenwick, who had been calling on Mrs. Palla, Hartwell at the same hour and was present when the Viscount's card was brought in, noted it with a stillness in her face that was nearly the opposite of her usual expressiveness. He sat in the small parlor with his hat on his knee, and spoke with Mrs. Hartwell about her health, with a courtesy that was not performance, and then he looked at Cordelia and said, "Miss Vane, I wondered if you might walk with me on the grounds, if Mrs. Hartwell can spare you." Mrs. Hartwell said she could be spared very easily. They walked in the kitchen garden, which was the only garden at present that offered shelter from the wind, and he asked her about her father's library again, and then about her father, and she answered both questions honestly because she had found in the short course of knowing him that performing with him was more effort than honesty, and also less interesting. She told him about the house that was gone, about the library that had been sold, about the specific quality of silence in a room whose shelves have been emptied, which is different from the silence of a room that was never filled. He listened the way some people listen, which is to say completely and without planning a response. And when she finished, he said, "I had a room like that, not from loss of money, from loss of purpose." She did not ask him to say more. She understood that he would say what he intended to say. "My daughter's room," he said. "I had it cleared because I thought it would be better." It was not better. He paused, and a muscle in his jaw moved once. It was only empty. The wind moved through the garden, and Cordelia felt the ache of it in her chest. Not on her own behalf now, and she said, very carefully, "Empty is its own kind of presence." He looked at her. Something in the look was different from the looks at the dinner and the assembly. Not cataloguing now, but arriving. And she felt the difference the way she felt the wind, as something physical that moved across the surface of her skin. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The kitchen garden smelled of cold earth and the last of the autumn lavender. He said, "I intend to return to Aldenmere in 3 weeks. My steward has matters requiring attention." She said she understood. He said, "I should like to write to you if that is acceptable." She said it was. They walked back through the kitchen garden, and she was aware of his shoulder close enough to feel the warmth from it through her Spencer jacket, and she did not allow herself to look at that shoulder or to think too carefully about the warmth, but her hand was not entirely still at her side. Dear God, she was not safe at all. The letters came. The first was brief and formal, describing a matter of estate drainage with such careful technical precision that she was fairly certain he had written it as a test to see if she would find it boring. She wrote back about the drainage in equal technical detail and then, in a postscript, asked a question about the kitchen garden at Aldenmere and whether he had found it in the condition his steward had predicted. The second letter was longer. By the fourth letter they had established a rhythm of exchange that she would have found, if she had examined it with the detachment of someone not inside it, remarkably intimate for two people who had met at a dinner table 3 weeks prior. He wrote as he spoke, with economy and precision, and the occasional sentence that surprised her by being precisely what she had been thinking and had not said. She wrote as she thought directly, and with more humor than she generally permitted herself in company, because his responses indicated that he noticed the humor and was not made uneasy by it. It was during this correspondence that she allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future that was not the one her present circumstances implied. Not with recklessness. Not with the spinning optimism of a girl who has not been taught what collapse feels like. She imagined it with the careful provisional hopefulness of someone who has carried loss, and knows that hope costs something, and has decided after consideration that the cost is worth the having. She was still imagining it very carefully when the second Fenwick dinner occurred. She had not been invited to the first Fenwick dinner. She had come to the second as Mrs. Hartwell's companion, and the invitation had been extended to Mrs. Bende. Hartwell, with a graciousness that made Cordelia understand, Lady Fenwick had reasons for wanting her present that had nothing to do with her own company. The reason arrived at dinner in the person of Miss Portia Greaves, who was placed above the salt and near the Viscount Aldenmere, and who wore sapphire earrings again, and addressed him across the table with the particular ease of someone who had been told, quietly and in advance, that this was the correct direction to address. Cordelia was placed below the salt again. The placement was a statement. She read it clearly. Miss Greaves was accomplished. She spoke French with what Cordelia suspected was genuine fluency, discussed music with a specific technical vocabulary, and addressed the Viscount with the bright, confident attention of a woman who had been told all her life that she was the correct choice. She was, by any fair accounting, a better match than she in every way the room would measure. Cordelia ate her fish and spoke with Mr. Brew, Pelham's wife, who had been placed beside her about the cold weather, and she kept her face in its practiced pleasantness, and she did not look at the Viscount more than was necessary, and when she did look, she found him in conversation with Miss Greaves and not looking back. She told herself this was information and not betrayal. The soup arrived, and Lady Fenwick said something to Mrs. Colbury that Cordelia could not hear, and Mrs. Colbury laughed and said more audibly, "Oh, the companion," and it was followed by a careful pause in which the companion was allowed to do its work. The label sat across her shoulders like a weight placed there by someone very practiced at placement. By the pudding course, she had achieved a kind of suspended stillness that she recognized as what people meant when they said grace under pressure, and what she privately knew was the state of someone who has run out of other options. She was still, the way glass is still, before it breaks. She was very, very still. The gentlemen rejoined the ladies at 9:30, and the drawing-room reorganized itself, and Miss Greaves moved to the pianoforte with the assurance of a woman fulfilling an expected role, and she played very well, better than at the first dinner, and the room attended with the quiet approval of people watching something go as planned. The Viscount stood near the fireplace. He had not moved toward Miss Greaves. He had not spoken to Lady Fenwick since entering the room. He stood with his coat still and his hands at his sides and his gaze on the pianoforte. And then, with a measured unhurriedness that meant he had decided, he crossed the room to where Cordelia sat near the window and stood before her. "Miss Vane," he said, "will you take a turn about the room with me?" It was not a question. It was also not what she had expected. She rose and took his arm, which was offered properly, and they walked the length of the room while the music continued, and while the room, she was aware, adjusted its collective attention to track them. He said low enough for only her, "Your face has been doing a very great deal of work this evening." "I'm not certain I know what you mean," she said, which was not true. "Yes, you do." He did not say it unkindly. He said it with the accuracy of someone who has been watching and has drawn the correct conclusion. "Lady Fenwick arranged this evening deliberately." "I know," she said. "And you were placed below the salt. Deliberately. I know that as well." They had reached the far wall and turned. "I should have arrived earlier and spoken to her before dinner," he said. The sentence had the quality of an admission rather than an excuse. "I failed to anticipate the precision of her arrangements." Cordelia looked at the middle distance. "I am a country solicitor's daughter with no connections and no money," she said. "Lady Fenwick's precision is not unreasonable." He was quiet for a moment. They walked the next stretch of room. "I intend," he said, "to speak to Mrs. Hartwell tomorrow." The sentence landed very quietly in the air between them. She looked at him then directly, because it required looking at directly. His face was grave and composed and held nothing that could be called uncertainty. It was the face of a man who has considered something over a length of time and has arrived at a conclusion he intends to carry out. "I must tell you," she said, with a steadiness she had assembled from whatever remained, "that I cannot be certain of your reasons, and that I would not wish to be the subject of an act of charity. I have experienced enough charity this year to know the difference between the kindness of the performer and the comfort of the recipient, and they are not reliably the same." He stopped walking. They were near the end of the room, near the door, and the music from the pianoforte covered their voices. "I know the difference between charity and want," he said. His voice was level and low and entirely without performance. "I have not written you 4 letters about drainage because I wish to perform charity." She did not answer immediately. Her heart was doing something she could not account for with composed terminology. "You should know," he said, "that this will not be simple. My family will have opinions. The county will have opinions. You will be placed below the salt in other rooms than this one, and by other women than Lady Fenwick." He looked at her with the directness she had catalogued at the bookshelves and at the assembly. "I am asking if you can carry that." "I have been carrying it since September," she said. Something moved across his face. Briefly, that was not quite a smile, and was not quite grief, and was something that lived in the narrow space between them. "Yes," he said. "I know. She should perhaps have paused longer. She should perhaps have slept on it and considered with greater prudence." She was aware, as she nodded very slightly, that she was not being prudent at all. She was, for the first time since her father's death, trusting something outside herself. He spoke to Mrs. Hartwell the following morning. Cordelia was not present, having been asked to take a walk by Mrs. Prosty. Hartwell herself, in a tone that suggested the walk was being offered as a strategic interval, and she had walked to the far end of the kitchen garden and back twice, and had listened to the wind and the bare winter trees, and told herself she was composed. She was not composed. She was terrified, in the specific way of someone who has allowed herself to want something real. When she returned, Mrs. Bria. Hartwell was in her chair by the fire, with an expression that Cordelia had learned to read as contained pleasure, and the Viscount Aldenmere was standing with his hat in his hand, and when she came through the door he looked at her and said, "Mrs. Hartwell has given me leave to speak to you. Will you hear me?" She said she would. What he said was brief, and not particularly ornamented. He said that he had observed her for 3 weeks. He said that observation had produced in him a conviction that was not quickly arrived at, and was not lightly stated. He said that he recognized she had given him no reason to expect a favorable answer, and that he wished to give her every opportunity to refuse. He said that if she would consent to be his wife, he would consider it a better outcome than he had believed himself entitled to, and that he would endeavor, with full knowledge of his limitations, to earn it. She said yes. She said it with her hands clasped in front of her, and her chin at the level angle she had practiced, and her heart conducting itself in ways that were entirely outside her jurisdiction. He took her right hand and held it very briefly in both of his. His hands were warm. She had not expected that. She had expected him to be competent and controlled and honestly inclined. She had not allowed herself to expect warmth. She looked at their hands for a moment, before she made herself look up. The third Fenwick dinner came within the fortnight, because Lady Fenwick's social calendar proceeded with the regularity of a mechanism that could not be unmade by private arrangements between persons she had not consulted. The engagement had not yet been announced publicly. Mrs. Hartwell knew Cordelia's distant cousin. The only family she had remaining had been written to. The Viscount had spoken to his own people at Aldermere. Lady Fenwick did not know, and it was apparent, from the particular enthusiasm with which she had issued the invitation, that she intended the third dinner to complete the work the second had begun. Cordelia dressed carefully. She wore the ivory silk because it was what she had, and she arranged her hair with the quiet precision of someone for whom precision was a form of dignity, and she told the mirror that she was composed, and on this occasion she was closer to truthful than she had been on the previous two. The guests arrived. Miss Greaves was present again, in emerald this time, with a new set of earrings and the posture of someone who has been told to be at her best. Lord Fenwick greeted everyone with the broad, cheerful indifference of a man who attends his own dinners primarily out of obligation. Lady Fenwick moved through the drawing-room before dinner with the brisk assurance of a conductor whose orchestra is assembled and waiting. She passed Cordelia near the window and said, without quite stopping, to Mrs. D. Colbury at her elbow, "Of course, the difficulty with companions is that they will attach themselves to circumstances. One sympathizes. Naturally. They have so little else." Mrs. Colbury murmured something appropriate, and Lady Fenwick moved on, and the label companions settled across Cordelia's shoulders exactly where the previous ones had settled, in the same practice location. Cordelia looked at the window glass and the dark garden beyond it, and she breathed, and she permitted herself, for the first time, a very small amount of what was coming. They went in to dinner. The table was arranged as it had been arranged twice before. Lady Fenwick's selections at the upper end, Miss Greaves positioned to advantage, the Viscount Aldenmere across the table from her, and Cordelia placed below the salt with a precise certainty that required no explanation. She sat. She unfolded her napkin. Mr. Pelham's wife was beside her again, and offered a sympathetic look that Cordelia returned with a nod and without interpretation. At the upper end of the table, Lady Fenwick began to speak with her usual assurance, addressing the Viscount on the subject of Aldenmere's prospects and the advantageous nature of the estate's current position. She spoke as a woman who has done her research. The implication of Miss Greaves, arranged at a slight diagonal to receive any answer he gave, was very precisely calibrated. The Viscount replied with short, level sentences that engaged the subject without engaging the implication, and Lady Fenwick smiled and redirected. And it went on in this fashion through the soup. Cordelia ate her soup. During the fish course, Lady Fenwick said, addressing Miss Greaves, in the carrying voice she used for statements intended to reach beyond their nominal target, "Miss Greaves, I have been saying to Lord Fenwick that a woman of your accomplishments must find the county somewhat limited. You will not remain long without a very particular sort of attention from a very particular sort of gentleman." She said this with a precision that could not be accidental and a smile that conveyed that the very particular sort of attention had been decided in advance. Cordelia put down her fish fork. She looked at the table above the salt. She looked at the salt cellar. She looked at Miss Greaves, who was beautiful and accomplished, and had done nothing wrong, and was a person whom the machinery had selected, rather than a person who had selected herself. She did not look at the Viscount because she had not been told she was permitted to look at the Viscount in a room where she had been placed below the salt. That was the logic of the room, and she had lived inside it for 3 dinners, and it was a logic she understood very precisely. She understood it so precisely that when he rose, she did not at first understand what she was seeing. He rose from his chair. The table had not concluded the fish course. Rising at this point was not done. Lord Fenwick looked up with the expression of a man who has witnessed a departure from protocol without any vocabulary to address it. The Viscount Aldemir set down his napkin, smoothed the front of his coat once, and walked the length of the dining-room table. Not to the door. Down the length of the table. Past Miss Greaves, who turned to watch with an expression that was not quite understanding. Past the salt cellar, which he did not look at. To the chair where Cordelia sat, with her fish fork in her hand and her face in its practiced pleasantness and her heart conducting itself outside her jurisdiction again, he stopped beside her chair and offered his hand. Not a gesture toward the door. His hand offered to be taken. The room was silent, in the specific way of a room that has understood something before anyone in it has spoken. Cordelia looked at his hand. She looked at his face. His face was grave and composed and entirely committed. She placed her hand in his. He said in a voice that was quiet but carried precisely to every corner of Lady Fenwick's dining room, "Miss Vane has consented to be my wife." 11 words. She counted them afterward. He held her hand in both of his, as he had in Mrs. Hartwell's parlor, with the warmth that she had not expected and had not been able to stop expecting. Since the room processed the sentence. The processing took a moment. Lady Fenwick's fan, raised partway through the fish course, stilled completely. Something moved across her face that was not quite recognition, and was something older and less comfortable than confidence. The expression of a woman whose script has just been handed to someone else, mid-performance. She recovered quickly, because 40 years of social precision does not abandon a person without a fight, and she assembled a correct expression with the practiced speed of a woman who has always known that appearances must be maintained. Miss Greaves looked at her own hands briefly, with a candor that Cordelia did not expect and found herself respecting. Lord Fenwick cleared his throat and raised his glass. "Congratulations, Aldemir," he said. "Well, congratulations." When the table, reading Lord Fenwick's response as permission, began to breathe again in ones and twos. And Mr. Gand. Pelham's wife pressed Cordelia's arm briefly from the left, and several voices offered felicitations, and the dining room reorganized itself around the new fact of the matter with the practiced efficiency of a company that has just received revised orders. Cordelia looked up at the Viscount, who was still holding her hand, and found him looking at her with the same direct quality she had catalogued 3 weeks ago at the bookshelves. Not inventory, not performance, but a look of arrival. She had been placed below the salt in this room 3 times. She had borne it 3 times. She had not expected anyone to notice, and she had not expected anyone to cross the length of the room to say so. She had been wrong, which she found was the most welcome she had ever been to an error. They left Lady Fenwick's dinner early, which no one attempted to prevent, Mrs. Pro. Hartwell waited in the hall with her wrap and her pleased expression, and the manner of a woman who has managed things well and is content to let events take their natural course. In the carriage, Cordelia sat very still and looked at her hands in her lap, which were in her gloves again, and the Viscount sat across from her with his hat on his knee, and Mrs. Hartwell made a small, satisfied sound and closed her eyes. "You did not have to do it at the table," Cordelia said quietly. "I know," he said. "You could have spoken to Lady Fenwick privately. It would have been less disruptive." "Yes," she looked at him. "Why did you not?" He was quiet for a moment. "The carriage moved through the dark lanes, because they placed you below the salt," he said. 3 times. "And I did not correct it the first time, which I should have done, and I could not leave the 3rd time without it being said in the same room where they said it." He looked out the window. "You were placed below the salt to shame you. I did not think the correction ought to be quiet." She was very still. "You are not below anything," he said. "That is what I wanted the room to hear." The carriage rolled on through the dark, and Mrs. Tock Hardwell breathed with quiet regularity, and Cordelia sat with something warm and enormous in her chest that she was no longer trying to contain or name. She thought of the salt cellar, small and silver on the long table, and the way it had stood like a monument to a verdict that had already been rendered against her. She thought of 3 dinners, and 3 labeled reductions, and the practiced pleasantness of a face that had been working very hard for several months. And she thought of his hand, offered palm up at the end of a table, in a room full of witnesses, and the 11 words that had been precise and irrevocable and sufficient. The wedding was held in December at the church in the village nearest Aldenmuir, in the company of Mrs. Hartwell and a small gathering of those people who had been part of the Viscount's world before his withdrawal from it, and who came, quietly and without ceremony, to see him return to it. It was cold, but the stone church smelled of candle smoke and winter. Cordelia wore a cream gown that Mrs. Hardwell had pressed upon her with the specific firmness of a woman who has decided what the occasion requires and will not entertain discussion. And she carried a small posy of winter greenery that the housekeeper at Aldenmuir had sent down the morning of the ceremony with a note in a round hand that said only, "Welcome home." The house was large and quiet and full of rooms she had not yet learned. The study smelled of leather and wood smoke. The library was better than she had hoped, which was saying something. On the second afternoon she found the door at the end of the east corridor closed, and she stood in front of it for a moment before moving on without opening it, because there would be a time to open it. But it would be the right time, and she would not force it. That evening Edmund came to find her in the library, where she had retrieved the volume of natural philosophy he had seen her with at Lady Fenwick's, and was reading it in the chair closest to the fire, and he sat in the chair, across from hers, and opened a letter from his steward about the drainage situation, which had apparently worsened, and they sat together in the quiet, with the fire crackling between them. After a time she said, without looking up from her book, "The east corridor door," he said. "Yes," she said. "When you are ready." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. "There is a small painting," he said. "A miniature. On the shelf inside," he paused. Of her, Cordelia looked up from the natural philosophy. He was looking at the fire with his jaw at the angle she had first noticed at Lady Fenwick's dining table, precise and held. "Then we will open it together," she said. "When you are ready." He looked at her. Then. The fire was the only light in the library, and it did not flatter so much as it revealed the particular quality of a face that has lost things and is still, with considerable effort, present. Still here, still choosing to be here. He said, "I believe I am nearly ready." He said it the way he said everything, with economy and precision and without performance, but there was something underneath the economy that was not distance. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back at her book, and the fire moved between them. And neither of them spoke, and the silence was of the kind that is settled rather than arrived, the silence of a room where 2 people have decided to be, and where the books are good, and where the warmth is shared without ceremony. Somewhere in the north wing of Aldenmuir, a clock ticked out the hour. Somewhere outside the window, the first snow of December was beginning to fall, soft and without announcement, covering the ground of the estate that was now also hers, and the bare limbs of the oaks, and the kitchen garden, and the stone churchyard where, on a very small stone, she turned a page. He set down his steward's letter and picked up a second one, and the fire went on burning, and the snow went on falling, and the library at Aldenmuir was warm. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments for what you are carrying quietly tonight. Thank you for being here until the end.